Mark and I are back at it again today, winding down, I think, a little bit because there's only 20 minutes left of the conversation between Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke that is almost psychedelic. But as it turns out, there's actually quite a bit more in this last 20 minutes than I thought. So we'll see how far we get. And as we left off last time, we had just finished, John Vervaeke had been talking about participatory knowing. And when we pick it up again, he's going to go through the rest of the 4 Ps. And so I'm going to play that little clip, and then I'm going to let you comment on it, Mark, since you are the 4P expert in this outfit here. So I'm going to share screen and got to share the sound, optimize. Okay. Here we go. And of course, things are not working as they should. There they are. Well, this might pick up a little bit of what we already did, but let's pick it up right about here.
They're getting into a flow state. They're picking up on affordances. They're making them salient. They're getting a dynamic, flowing situation.
Music does that too.
Yes, exactly. And music is how we do serious play with our salience landscaping. Okay, so now
he says as a casual aside.
So that's the perspectival knowing. Once we have situational awareness, what does situational awareness do? Situational awareness basically tells you which skills should you bring to bear. Is swimming relevant here? Well, no. Well, how do I know? My situational awareness. So the perspectival
That's your ability
knowing,
to read the story.
Well, yes, right, exactly. So which skills should you bring to bear? That's the procedural knowing. Once you've got your skills engaged, and this is the fundamental point of the pragmatist, right? That it's also, it's your skilled activity that undergirds your propositional. Once the procedural knowledge is properly engaged, then
that's what understand means.
Yes, right, exactly.
Yes.
So that's what I'm doing. You see, I'm trying to build it up, participatory, right, into perspectival, into procedural, into propositional. And the new atheists and modernity and all of this stuff is locked in a propositional tyranny, and it's cut us off from all of this. And cutting us off from this cuts us off from the body, cuts us off from the primary connection.
And that propositional tyranny, is that best encapsulated in the idea that there's nothing outside the text?
Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Yeah. There's actually, there's a lot there, right?
Yeah, and I don't want to go into that bit about outside the text until we finish up with the 4 Ps. So, so it started in with perspectival knowing, and we didn't pick up everything that was part of that. So maybe you want to just kind of go over what did we kind of recap the participatory knowing, and then go over what perspectival knowing is, and then we'll keep going with the 4 Ps.
Sure. So the participatory gives us options. It allows us to participate in affordances, right? It generates the affordances. And then, you didn't make your body, but you can shape it and move it, right? And it constrains how the world is delivered. And that's the knowing at the level of embodiment, right? That's what John says. And then the perspectival makes available. It makes affordances salient to me in a way that other affordances are not present. In other words, it's excluding affordances based on your perspective as such. And then it's what's conscious to you, a sense of presence. And he uses verisimilitude, and he says a flow state is something that you get from this sense, which is an interesting way to put it. And then he sort of ties that back in with this idea of situational awareness and procedures.
Okay, before we get on to the procedures, though, I want to stay here with the perspectival for a minute, because you said the perspectival means that it makes the affordances salient to me.
Right.
So that seems a little bit different than Jordan's take, because Jordan's take on that is that the salience comes from having your eyes fixed on the highest goal.
Right. Well, Jordan went through this in the beginning. He said, no, you participate. So effectively what John's saying is embodiment, participation. It's not just embodiment, but participation comes first. And what Jordan's saying is, and this is very Piaget, and they're both fans of Piaget. It's very Piaget. Knowledge is embodied; it comes up through the body, etc. So they're both on that train. But I think that the fundamental difference here is that Jordan's pointing to, yeah, but all that stuff has to come from somewhere outside, and John is grounding everything in the body.
Okay, so we're back at that place again. And then he talks about the situational awareness, which is getting back to the affordances thing again, right? Because he's saying, would swimming be useful to me in this context? No. So that's not an affordance that I'm worried about right now.
So he kind of bridges, and I've never heard him talk about situational awareness before. This is the first time I've heard him talk about it.
Okay, so then I'm confused.
I was like, what? Because he actually talks about it with perspective too.
Yeah.
Right? Which makes me think if it spans two types of knowing, it's not either one of them. I don't know. But again, we have a different model, and we have a different model for this reason. It's these little things that we're like, no, those can't be in the knowing. They have to be separate from the knowing. And then, yeah, if procedural is which procedures do you bring to bear, then that kind of makes sense. But yeah, I was taken aback by that, by him bringing up situational awareness.
Well, the weird thing is when he says, which skills should you bring to bear? Is swimming salient here? No. And then Jordan jumps in and says, that's your ability to read the story. Honestly, the way his mind works.
Which made it worse. Yeah, that made it much worse.
Where was he coming from with that statement?
Well, I think, again, look, everyone, we didn't come up with our model for nothing on the Discord server. Everyone's pointing at the same thing. They're all pointing at this type of understanding or knowing or knowledge about stories. Stories don't make any sense propositionally. And they go into this later, right? But we have to jump to it now. This is where the postmoderns got it wrong. The text does not contain everything in the story, because the story is a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. So what is that? Well, that's, for our Discord server, that's the poetic way of knowing. That's why we move everything around.
Well, so I guess what I'm trying to nail down here is John had just said what participatory knowing is, and then he had gone on and described perspectival knowing, the salience landscaping and all of that stuff. And then he says situational awareness tells you which skills you need to bring to bear on this salient landscape. And that's, so when Jordan jumps in, that's your ability to read the story. It sounds like he's talking about the situational awareness.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
I agree.
So,
which means
the situational awareness is in that metaphor space someplace.
For Jordan, I think it is. But if you think about what John said, and when he said it, he used it to bridge those two types of knowing. And like I said, this is new to me. He hasn't bridged them before. He's put them in hierarchies
Bridging
before.
perspectival and procedural.
Yes. Right. And he's never explicitly stated, in this way that participatory comes first and perspectival's built on that, right? He's talking about how they're built up. He's never done that before. He has linked them before.
So what makes sense to me is he's just spent 2 hours talking with Jordan, and Jordan's been popping in with all this stuff about where does the value piece lie, right? And John has absorbed that.
Yep.
And so maybe he's thinking on the fly that that there has to be a link between the perspectival and the procedural, because that's exactly the space that Jordan inhabits when he's talking about standing at the threshold of the next moment and choosing what the next step is to take. That's that space between the perspectival that's built into me and the next procedure that I need to take that's based on that higher goal that brings things into my salience landscape.
Exactly.
So by John putting that situational awareness thing in there, it sounds like he's bridging that gap because now he knows that there was a gap.
Right. I agree.
Too much into it?
Nope. I think you're right. This is another instance of true dialogos where John got somewhere he couldn't have gotten without Jordan. I mean, that happens all throughout this conversation. I try to point it out when I think it's there. This is definitely a moment. It's happening on Jordan's end too, right? Like they're both going places they couldn't get to otherwise. That's John's formal definition of dialogos. And I think this is an instance of that because, again, he's put these in a hierarchy before and he keeps switching perspectival and participatory. And I don't know what he's on about because, of course, we took it out. We said, no, perspectival's got to be way deeper than a type of knowing. And, we replaced it with poetic so that we can solve the story problem. But yeah, he sees it. He sees, especially because Jordan interrupting constantly with all these things that are missing in his description of participatory. If participatory comes first, then that was all the interruptions Jordan did. And there were like half a dozen of them. And I think John in the moment found the problem with putting participatory first. The way we solved it was we shoved it all in perspectival and said, this is before all types of knowing. Mm-hmm. That's why, see our first video, right? That's what makes our model different.
That's what totally makes sense to me, because that's the only thing that's ever made sense to me is that we have this built-in, I wish I could figure out what to call it, like a matrix that's got little fuzzy things on it. And that's where knowing connects to all that,
Exactly. Right? Exactly. Yeah, you need a framing device that's flexible so that you can have multiple frames in order to do the knowing. Otherwise, it's not knowing because you don't even have information. So I agree.
Let me pop in here with just a little piece that I read this. I'm rereading The Master and His Emissary, or at least parts of it, because Ian McGilchrist is I get to talk to him in October.
That's awesome. Great.
Oh, right.
How exciting.
So I was rereading and he's talking in the chapter on the Enlightenment. And he's differentiating between reason and rationality. And reason correlates to the nous, and rationality correlates to logos, or reason correlates to the German word Vernunft, and rationality correlates to Verstand, which is the other German word. And let's say reason corresponds to intellectus, and rationality corresponds to ratio or ratio. So, okay. So he's saying that the right hemisphere is the reason part that brings in the new information, the new knowledge, the new, usually, metaphor, that more open way of knowing. Mm-hmm. And then the left hemisphere does the rationality thing with it. But there was this problem in the Enlightenment that it started getting stuck on the rationality. And when it's stuck there, it just starts atomizing upward and upward and upward in these constructions that have nowhere to go. And that Kant came along and said, no, it's not reason to rationality, it's rationality to reason. That rationality is fundamental. Or so, I mean, sort of, that's, anyway, I don't understand the whole thing, but the point that McGilchrist is making is that Kant was not wrong, but Kant was just really making a point about the second half of the process, because it has to be reason first as fundamental, and then rationality, and then rationality has to go back through the filter of reason in order to make sense of what has been constructed, in order to make the most of what has been constructed. So the right hemisphere brings it in, it goes to the left hemisphere does its thing, and then it's supposed to bring it back through the filter.
Go back.
Right. Yeah. So if you're talking about perspectival as being the root, or kind of the thing that's inside of us that all the knowledge attaches to, that perspectival would be kind of like, that's kind of the playground of the right hemisphere. The way I would think.
Oh, yeah, no, see, yeah, all that's too complicated. Like, I think it just comes in and that's it. It comes into the perspectival and it gets split off into 4 buckets. And then it comes back down and they negotiate. And so the way we do it on our model is rationality is between the perspective and the types of knowing. Because it's the way we use the word, right? When you rationalize something, what you're saying is, I don't care about the new information. I'm privileging my perspective. That's what you're doing, right? So, not all the time when you use the word, but often we say, oh, no, he's just rationalizing his behavior. What does that mean? That means he knows his behavior is bad, but is doing it anyway because he's preferring his perspective over the information he has. And I think that's correct.
This is a real problem with English because we use reason and rationality interchangeably.
All the time.
And
Yep.
we use rational and rationalizing as two different things.
Right.
When you're rationalizing, you're not being rational.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
right. So that's why it's in between. But that's why it's in between, right? So all you're saying is, oh, it's the same word, but it's directional. Rationalize is going down and rational is going up.
What?
When you
just made a move on me. You lost me.
When you're rationalizing, you're preferring your perspective over your knowledge. When you're being rational, you're preferring your knowledge over your perspective.
Oh, okay.
Right. And that's why our model is set up the way it is. And John's model can't account for any of this, by the way. Like and it's not designed to be fair to John, it's like he's not trying to do that. But I think it's useful to do.
So take that model there and help me between science and scientism.
Well, so yeah. So the way we talk, so you talked about stuckness, and stuckness is something we talk about all the time. It's perspectival stuckness, though. If your perspective is preferring the answer on the right side all the time because it has more certainty, because the right side is it's all certain, right? If you're stuck thinking about propositions and procedures, then your world is certain and discrete and linear and closed. Mm-hmm. But the only way to deal with the world that way is basically by making idols of everything, right? Because you're effectively going to confuse the thing for the description of the thing, and you're going to lose all the depth of the world. And you can't understand something like God, and you can't read text non-literally, which is real handy for postmodernism, because then you can say, oh, all there is what's in the text. Well, when you say that, all you're saying is, I can only read a text literally. That's what you're saying. And that's not good. That's not good. I mean, then you can't read the Bible. You won't understand any of it. I actually have people do this all the time. They go, they'll use the common example, like, oh, hating gays is part of the, it's built right into the Bible. It's one of the laws of the Bible. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's not. That's not a law in the Bible. Mm-hmm. There are laws in the Bible, but there's only 10 of them. Like, that's it. There's really only 10. If you think there's more than 10, you didn't read the Bible correctly. Sorry. And then they go through a story. And I'm like, no, that's a story. And that's not what that story means, whether or not that's what that story seems to say, which are two different things. It's the literalist interpretation versus the metaphorical interpretation. But you can't use a literalist interpretation on a story. You can only use the literalist interpretation on a textbook, basically. Mm-hmm. And so that's where the difference comes in. And so what happens is, if you're stuck with procedures as your mode of navigating the world, you're going to end up in scientism every time, because you don't have a way to understand what's relevant, because procedures don't tell you what's relevant. They only give you a process for ending up at a certain end point based on a starting point.
Well, so part of the problem is that even the choices that they make of what to study come from an intuition that is pre-logical.
Right. You can't use logic to arrive at anything useful. It's just, sorry, you can't. You can use logic to arrive at anything, though. And that's where the problem comes in. And I talked about this, at least with Paul. I don't know if I discussed it with you, but I used to play this trick on people all the time. I'd say logic, reason, and rationality are useless tools, and I will use them to justify anything you want. You name you set the thing, and at the end, you will be convinced yourself that none of what I said broke those three precepts, and we're going to end up at a place that you're not going to like, right? And then they go the Holocaust. I'm like, well, Hitler already did that, but if you want me to do it in front of you, and you can agree that none of it's wrong, and reliably, to be fair, no one ever disagreed. They could never find an illogical move that I made. They could never find an irrational move that I made. Nothing that I said was unreasonable. None of it, because those things don't tell you what's important. They just give you a path.
That makes you a very dangerous man, Mark.
I agree. I think I'm a very dangerous person too, and a lot of other people do too, and they should.
Well, going back and kind of clearing up something here, you said on the right side, when you said propositions and procedures, I don't want anybody to confuse that with the right side of the hemispheres, because you're talking about the right side of your graph of breaking up the 4 Ps. On the right side are propositions and procedures, which are the more analytical, more rational side.
Well, no, it's not rational. It's discrete, and it's linear, and it's a one-to-one connection set, right? And so again, for us, propositions are navigated with procedures. So the thing that gives you the procedure about the object or the proposition is not in the proposition. It's separate from it. And that's why we go into this navigation metaphor, and then we use it on the other side of the graph where it's more useful, and we add in the poetic because that's open, it's nonlinear. So you can have multiple connection points, multiple jumping on and jumping off points. That's what makes stories work, because you read a story and then somebody else reads the same story and you get different lessons out of it. Well, that's not possible if you're reading it literally. And this is where the postmoderns go wrong. I mean, this explains, we'll call it the postmodern evil. This explains the whole thing. Like, yeah, you can divide a text a bunch of different ways. There are procedures for dividing texts, but you can only divide them literally if you're using a procedure. So you can't understand the lesson of the text, but you can make up a bunch of ways to slice and dice the text that may or may not make sense. And that's where you get into trouble with postmodernism. They may or may not make sense. They're valid because they're logical, rational, and reasonable, but they're not valid because they don't make any sense in the poetic way of understanding things. And that's what's different.
Well, so when we get to this place in the video, and John starts stacking up the 4 Ps, he says the propositional goes into the procedural, and the procedural into the perspectival, and the perspectival into the participatory. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to build it up, he says. So
he builds from participatory outward. He starts with participatory, it goes to perspectival, and then
so I was
procedural, and then propositional.
Sorry, I was writing it down the way he said it, and then I was looking at it as though it was a tower, so I got it upside down. The participatory into the perspectival, into the procedural, into the propositional.
Right, and his description gets smaller along the way too, you'll notice, right? Propositional, he literally, to describe the entire propositional way of knowing, right? All he actually says is, this is how they emerge. What? Which is kind of crazy to me, because he had a better definition before, which is, this is a glass. That's a proposition. That's a better definition, right?
Well, he's probably just assuming that everybody knows what he means when he says propositional. It's the other ones that are less people are less aware of, because he's come up with his own definitions for some of the other ones.
I agree. And then he says, well, they stop at propositions, and that cuts everything off. And then, to take it seriously, well, they don't stop at propositions, they stop at propositions and procedures is my argument. And then, they don't cut off the body, they cut off the ability of anybody to properly navigate a story, to understand non-literal interpretations of things. And non-literal interpretations are something like icons. And so if you can't understand what's behind an icon, and Paul van der Klee had a brilliant thing about icons. He says, well, you either accept or reject the icon. And it's like, oh, that's an interesting way to think about it. So you see the icon and you either reject it, right? Because whatever's behind it is too big for you. Like maybe it's representation of the ineffable. And you're like, oh no, I'm not going there. I'm going to reject the icon. Or you accept the icon, which means you move through it. In some sense, you move past it and into it, and you inhabit whatever it's representing, right? Because it's not a stopping point. It's not an icon's not a proposition. An icon is a representation of something other than what it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I do want to get into the whole icon and idol thing, but before we get there, I want to go back to just one thing about John Vervaeke said, which skills should you bring to bear? That's the procedural knowing. And then he said,
Right.
This is the fundamental point of the pragmatist. It's your skilled activity that undergirds your propositions.
Right.
And Jordan jumps in with, that's what understand means,
Yes.
right? Stand under.
Right. Undergird. Right.
Yes, undergird. And that occurred to me that the way that connects up is that he's always saying your actions betray your values,
Yes.
which is another way of saying you can't know something properly until you put it into practice. You can't say that you know something properly until you put it into practice.
Exactly.
I know that that's obvious because John was talking about pragmatists, but just in case anybody isn't up to speed on Jordan's background, I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah.
So we can move on then. We got to the propositional tyranny, and now we're into nothing outside the text, and we're going to go into Derrida. So I'm going to play that part.
Okay.
It'll come. It'll come.
And Derrida, I forget who wrote the book Semiological Reductionism. He's open to this kind of critique. Derrida, of course, has something outside of the text, which is difference itself, right? And that's the whole point. Difference can't be captured in the text. It can't be separated from the text. But so he has this doorway, and that's why he gets attracted so much to negative theology. That's why, I would argue that's why.
Negative theology, what do you mean?
So negative theology was part of Neo-Platonic Christianity, heavily influenced by the ineffable experiences that people have within mystical experiences, which is ultimate. And it's also based on a critique of, you shouldn't think of God as a thing, right? This is the no-thingness of God, not the nothingness, the no-thingness. We should also talk about the confusion of those contributes to nihilism, but we'll maybe come back to that another day. Right. So the idea of negative theology is you fundamentally, I wonder if this is like Jung's circumambulation. You fundamentally understand God by saying what God is not, but not, of course, randomly. Right. What you're trying to do is.
Oh, that's sort of like the God of the gaps.
Well, no.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's.
So I'm going to stop here for just a minute to clear up some definitions.
Good idea. Yeah, this is a tough spot, actually.
Yeah, because John is saying that Derrida became attracted to negative theology. And then George says, what do you mean? What's negative theology? So he starts trying to explain it. And he starts out first by saying it's heavily influenced by the ineffable experiences that people were having within their mystical experiences.
Right.
You shouldn't think of God as a thing. It's the no-thingness of God.
Right.
This is sort of like the God of the gaps. Now, negative theology is actually something called apophatic theology, which is this idea that you cannot describe God directly. You can only describe him by what he is not.
Right.
John could have said something simple like that. Instead, he went off into this long thing.
Well, that's the whole trick they play. They rename things constantly to make them sound way. And it's like, no, we already have a word for that. Stop doing a new word. So yeah, He did. He made it very complicated.
And when Jordan jumps in and is trying to clarify, and he says, so it's like the God of the gaps, John did not explain that. So I will explain that. The God of the gaps is this idea that people always use as a straw man to knock down anybody who's trying to say, yes, there is God. That in the old days, when everybody was stupid and living in a cave, when there was thunder, they thought that's a god. When there was lightning, they thought that's another god. When the crops came up, they said that's another god. And so little by little, as science has explained these things, there's no longer any unknowns. And so God was only in the unknowns because people were saying, oh, we can't explain this thing, so it must be God. And so once all those gaps are filled in, we won't need God anymore. So the God of the gaps idea is this idea that people are trusting in the unknown things as the place where they find God.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But that's not where you find God. You find God in everything. So.
Well, and the real point is the whole point of God is to have something to transcend towards, in essence, or transcend into, which is some greater outside thing. Mm-hmm. And it's very much the same. One more piece of data, Karen, and we'll know consciousness. One more piece of data, and we'll know how bumblebees fly. One more piece, and it's on and on. It's endless with these people because they're not, even though the science proves there's an infinite amount of detail, they don't take that seriously. Your own science and math proves there's an infinite amount of detail. Mm-hmm. Are you saying that there's no gaps? What are you saying at that point? If there's an infinite amount of detail, there have to be gaps, like at least in our understanding. So you're not going to get rid of God that way. But to your point, that's not the point. The point is the thing that's outside, that's higher. Mm-hmm. That's what's important, is that thing that's up and higher that we aspire to. We need aspiration to do science. Otherwise, why bother with this science? Like, why are we trying to close these gaps? Well, maybe the reason why we're trying to close it is so that we can close off God and become God ourselves. Fair enough. Sounds like a psychological problem to me. Just saying, but that seems to be what it is. Like that. So even in trying to disprove God, you're actually proving the existence of God because you're trying to become God. Well, are you sure you're doing what you think you're doing? Because I think you're doing the opposite at that point. But hey, what do I know?
Well, the good thing that John did was by saying that God, you shouldn't think of God as a thing. So it's the no thing.
Yes,
God, because
that's true.
If you start thinking of God as a thing, then you end up with, like when I lived in Japan, there was a God in everything. There was the God of the fox. There was the God of your closet. There was the God of the little kitty cat toy that sits on the counter. Everything is a God. There's like millions of gods, and we can't see it that way because God is the one that was a transcend, the ineffable. So yeah.
Well, it's interesting. It's the difference between seeing God in everything and seeing everything as God, right? It's like, oh, there's actually a subtle difference between those two things, right? Like, oh, right. And this gets back to, what Paul van der Klaes says all the time about, Frodo can't see Tolkien, and yet Tolkien is everywhere in Frodo's world. Yes. Everywhere, though, not in pieces, because it's non-propositional. And it's weird that John acquiesces to this because he doesn't have a way in his model to talk about this. It's all outside. And then it's like, well, if it's Neo-Platonic one, then is that outside? Like, how does that fit into? How do you know that? What type of knowing would it be to know the Neo-Platonic one? Be a good question to ask John. I don't know what he'd say. Maybe at the next Q&A on our Discord server, I'll ask him, like, how do you describe our knowledge of the Neo-Platonic one? How does that fit in the 4 Ps? And see what he says, because we have a bunch of questions about Neoplatonism anyway. So,
well, the other thing I thought that was very telling about what he said was he sort of made a little aside when he's talking about understanding what God is not. He said, I wonder if this is what Jung meant by circumambulation. So, right. So I looked up circumambulation, and I want to show everybody something.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. It is. It's very interesting.
We talk about that quite a bit on the Discord server. Circumambulation is a big deal to us.
Is it? I think it's here. Yeah, okay. Circumambulation mostly means this idea of, like with a labyrinth,
Yes.
there's an idol or something that you worship in the middle, and you go around the outside of it, and you keep going
Right.
outside, and you know, trying to get closer to the center.
Mhm.
But this is talking about something called categorizing, which I've never heard before, but categorizing is it's a certain way of approaching life as your goal, a perfectionist energy towards the ultimate project of circumambulation. I'm right here. You are aiming at an ideal, who you could be, in a steadfast and committed way. You don't know who you could be. You don't know if success is possible, but you don't need to justify the effort in some grandiose way. Respect for categorizing is enough. It can be your axiom.
Mm.
In circumambulating, perhaps it is a leap of faith to insist that there even is a center.
Yeah.
Maybe it's all made up. Perhaps the center is a vague conception of who you would be if you developed maximally, but you can't define it or penetrate it. You can only think about it, only move around it. You spiral around the center, trying to see it from different angles, sometimes closer and sometimes farther away. So, but it's more like it's the self that's at the center. When I looked up somewhere, there's an actual quote from Jung, and I can't find that part of it, so sort of irrelevant. But somewhere there's an actual quote from Jung where he's talking about how you're circling around yourself.
Right.
So if that's what John is thinking about when he says,
Yes.
that's what Jung meant by circumambulation, that's completely leaving out, because where the people have these mazes, like in some of the churches, the whole point of the circling is to contemplate, to meditate the transcendent. As you move closer and closer to the center, you're hopefully moving closer and closer to the one, and
right.
not to your inner self, which is not the one.
Right.
Okay.
Right. John often switches these two. And then he says, yeah, but there's a Neo-Platonic one. And it's like, yeah, but you're not making a connection between you and the Neo-Platonic one. You got to make, like I said, what's the type of knowing that's involved? Where is the circumambulation? So, and I agree. And if you think about it like the elephant, right? The blind people and the elephant, think about, well, what if there's only one person trying to figure out the elephant? And then as they move and they feel out parts of the elephant, they have to remember the previous parts, but you never quite can hold the whole thing in your head. And so you circumambulate the elephant in your blindness, right? From all sides, right? It's three-dimensional, right? And the whole time you're forgetting the first part. So you have to keep circumambulating. Well, that's life. That sounds reasonable to me. And then it's not, right? And then distributed cognition helps you, being in a church, in the body, the larger body that holds you to the Neo-Platonic one even, right? That would help you, because now you can just call out and say, oh, I'm over here and I feel this. It's like, oh yeah, but over here is this. It's like, so it's sort of like, well, if God were the elephant, you'd be reminding each other of God by being together in the body, talking about it. How convenient would that be if that's how it works, Karen? So yeah. But circumambulation, the way John's using it and the way Peterson's using it, is very self-centered, literally centered around one's self. And that's never going to get you transcendence. Definitionally, what cannot be transcendent. It's always going to fall into itself.
Well, since this is Jung's idea, and a lot of the other language in that categorizing clip that I was reading from sounds a lot like Jordan's language. Whoever wrote that, it sounds like they'd been either they've both gotten the same thing from Jung, or this guy had been listening to Jordan's lectures and then wrote this thing. So then, do you think Jordan also thinks that you're just circling around the self?
I think they're middle out guys. I think they're saying objective material reality and everything's going up and down from there. And that can't be true. Like it's a ridiculous premise by their own construct. This is the thing that amuses me. They're circumambulating that idea and they're not seeing it. And I see it totally clearly. I'm like, well, yeah, but if what you're saying is true, then what that actually means is, and they're not getting to the what that actually means is part. They're not seeing that last connection that, well, then there has to be something outside of yourself. I mean, I think I said this before, right? Like
the picture I get is that the way you're describing it, it's almost like it's a disc rather than a sphere.
Well, no, I think it is a sphere, for sure. But the way they're talking about it is on a disc, because they're stuck in the middle, and they're saying, no, we have mastery of this. We can science this. We're going to science this for sure. We just need a little more science and we'll be fine. Like, add some drops of science and this whole disc will work out. But it's not. It's a sphere, and everything's coming from above and below. And they're starting from the middle, saying, no, we can understand this from the middle. And I'm going, no, you can't. And your own theory should tell you otherwise, right? So if the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, what's the whole of all human goodness? Okay, go ahead, answer that one, right? Well, the answer to that is something like God, right? It would have to be. Like, there's no other option there. And so, well, then you can't do a middle out equation, because the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And you're one of the parts. You're not going to be able to bridge that gap. It won't go this way. It only goes this way.
Well, let's keep going, because we're making some progress. But I think we've gotten 3 minutes. It's kind of hopeless. Oh, I'm going to back it up a little bit because we're running into sound issues.
No. Sorry.
No. Don't apologize. We're friends talking.
Well, I don't want to derail the conversation. So
it's been like this, and it's been wonderful. It feels to me like doing Tai Chi. It's more of a recognition of, not of the God of the gaps, but of a recognition how our categorical scheme is always inadequate. So, for example, is God an object? Well, no, that's wrong. Is God a subject like the way we are? No, that's wrong too. That's inadequate.
Right. So God escapes our categorical.
Right.
God is by definition, in some sense, what escapes our categorized.
Because God is supposed to be the grounding of the intelligibility that makes the categorical scheme possible. At least that's
right. But God's also present within the category scheme if it's set up properly. So.
Right. So the point about negative theology, that's why it's not just the God of the gaps. The point is to see within the category, that it's present within the categories, but it's not capturable within the categories. That's what you're trying to do.
The category, the reality supersedes the categories, which is why you're not supposed to make idols. Why you're not supposed to make representations of God.
You can make icons. To summon Jonathan back into the conversation one more time, you can make icons, right? And you got John Luke Marion's distinction between the idol and the icon.
What's the distinction?
The distinction.
The icon does not capture God.
Right. That's exactly it.
That's an artwork. So an artwork is an icon.
Exactly.
And a propaganda is an idol.
Yes, I would agree with both of those statements.
Well, isn't that something? Because they're really, in some sense, far astray, aren't they? But they do map, and so how cool is that? So art is the icon. How cool. And propaganda is the idol. Exactly, man. And I had these paintings in my house, and they were melds of the icon and the idol. Well, right, because there's all this socialist realism. I have 200 pieces of socialist realism, watching the icon and the idol fight with each other.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, so there's some interesting stuff in there. So
there is.
John says, God is not a subject like us. That's what he said. And I was like, wait a minute. If we're subjects, what are we subject to, John?
Well, now you might be reading more in than what was there, right? I heard him say, is God an object? No. Is God a subject? No.
No, he said, is God a subject like us?
Oh.
Yes.
Okay.
You missed that. And I picked it up. I was like, wait a minute. What do you mean God's a subject like us?
Well, but when he's using subject, isn't he just using the object-subject paradigm, not in the sense of being a subject to a monarch or something, right? Or
I don't think there's any difference. Like, I think when you're using the word subject, it has to be the word doesn't change meaning. That word's meaning is the same throughout.
Well, I throw the ball. I'm the subject. The ball is the object.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are you subject to? You're subject to your relationship with the ball in that case.
Well, I have control over the ball.
But you're subject to the relationship for your definition. Because you're saying I'm not the ball and I'm the thing that has control of the ball. So you're subject to that relationship.
Okay.
Yeah. So the fact that you're using it in essence backwards doesn't mean the meaning changes. It just changes how we process it. But actually you're still the subject because you're the thing taking action. But a subject is taking, and this is where it gets into this whole thing of, so I did a video, I haven't released it yet. I'm doing a video on power. And it's like, well, yeah, but there's nothing has power over you. Nothing. Pastor Paul says this all the time. You can't make me hate you. So how much power do you have over me? If you can't make me hate, can't make me work, I can just sit. You can't, you can starve me, you can kill me, starve me to death, sure, but you can't make me do things. So, at some point, like, well, what does subject mean? Well, it means you don't have full control. Sure, absolutely. Nobody has full control over anyone else, and we don't even have full control over ourselves. So fair enough. But then there's got to be a relationship between the subject and the things, whether it's controlling them or they're controlling it. It's the call out of that relationship.
Well, but I always thought when they were talking this way about subject and object, that they were talking about like the subjective view, the view from inside of me, and the objective view would be the view from outside. So the more scientific view would be the supposedly objective view, because supposedly scientists can be objective.
Right.
They can vanish the subjective side of things, so the subjective would be all tied up with the perspectival and whatever my value structure is and whatever my matrix is and all of that.
Right. Well, except John doesn't put values anywhere. Right. That's the one of the flaws that we pointed out earlier. And I have a video on this where I talk about perspectival versus subjective versus there's no objective. Mm-hmm. And there can't be, because the best definition we have for objective, and we'll call it objective material reality, that's the term I like to use because that's usually how it's used, is we all agree, roughly speaking, right? Or some number of people agree. And it's like, well, yeah, but does that make something objective? Because there's no observer, there's no object. Because the word's built in, observe is built into object. And that's what people don't realize. Like, if there's no observer, there's no object. And if there is an observer, then it's subject to the observer. And you're subject to your perspective. Like, there's still subjectivity all the way down. And you're a slave to that subjectivity in some sense, because whatever perspective, two people can see the same thing, objective same thing, and have a different perspective on it. And that gets all kinds of messy, because perspective is not just interpretation, but it's also interpretation of conclusion. So you can have the same interpretation of the thing, right? But you can have a different conclusion about how it got there or how to get there or what to do with it. And all of that's tied up in subjectivity and perspective. But we don't think of it that way because there is an objective thing to agree about. But agreeing about an objective thing doesn't solve anything.
Isn't that the exact argument the postmoderns make, though? And if we go down that route, don't we fall into the pit that the postmoderns are digging for us?
Well, I don't think so, because again, they say everything's literal and can be understood. They think everything's in the text. And Vervaeke and Peterson agree it's not. Fair enough. And then Vervaeke again tries to resurrect Derrida's soul and say, he would have been fine had he just kept going. I'm like, what? That doesn't count. Even if that's true, and that can't be true because it didn't happen. In some sense, it's not real because he never got there. Who cares? You don't know what his conclusion would have been. He could still have said, no, postmodernism is still true the way Foucault outlined it. I don't know. Which is interesting because they make this same point with Heidegger. And they say, no, had Heidegger not done this one thing, he would have rejected Nazism. Are you sure? And they make a very compelling case, and they might be right. I'm not saying they're wrong, but you can't. At a certain point, you're really out on a limb when you're making statements like that. Who knows? People defend their perspective to the death, even in light of, knowledge to the contrary. And that's the problem, is that it's very much wrapped up in this idea of subjective objective. And when you're starting from objective material reality, when you're doing this middle out trick, you're saying, here's the ground of being. And that's the other trick they play in this, is that John says, well, God's also the ground. It's like, oh, no, he's not. He created the ground, but it's not him. Those are different things. And John says that in that little clip. It's like, nope, that's wrong too, John. That's definitely not correct. That's not the understanding. And it's because they want to recreate it from the middle out.
Okay, so maybe I understand the ground of being somewhat differently, because I didn't realize it was quite as cut and dried as that. When you say ground of being, what do you mean?
So I think the way people use ground of being is as a plea towards objective material reality. So they're stating there is a ground, which is a physical thing, right? And that being springs forth from that. And that's the way.
An emergent property of whatever, if the ground is all these strings out there in the quantum fields. Yep. That's the ground.
Right. You have all right. Yeah. You can make a quantum case for ground of being.
So
and then bootstrap
the
evolution
is the ground, basically.
Exactly.
Okay.
The objective material reality, the atoms and the whatever, wherever they came from, because Big Bang, and then we get back into string theory and that craziness, right? So wherever that came from, that's how evolution, that totally explains evolution.
Because
right? It's just that
some people say the ground of being, and it sounds like what they're really saying is being itself.
Right.
They're confusing, or they're fusing being and grounded being as the same thing.
Exactly. I would say
you're differentiating the two and saying that the ground of being is really referring to just the resource of which the universe is composed.
Yes.
Being is the one who created the resource, and
or
not the
being
resource himself.
Or being as the field outside of all of the materiality. Mm-hmm. Which would make the materiality subject to that potential, right? So being is the potential and the ineffable, right? And then so there is no ground of being, it's being as such. And it's like, oh, well, we sprang up from being as such. Fair enough. Like, why put the ground in there at all? Because you're a scientist. Well, maybe that's where all the problem happens, is because John talks about cultural cognitive grammar. I take that seriously. Using the word ground is dangerous because you're going to refer to material reality again. And there's no objective material reality. I'm still stuck on that. I still think that's true. But even if there is, Einstein proved it's not useful. It's not a useful concept because we can't occupy the same space at the same time. So it's not helpful. Like, okay, maybe, but even if that were true, you still need an objective observer. Well, now you put God right back into the equation again.
Mm-hmm.
Something I don't care. Like, either way you want to get to God, but the thing is, he keeps popping up.
Well, yeah, that's the whole thing with the quantum physics thing, with the need for an objective observer, because before there were any observers, which according to them is like 4.5 or 3 billion years ago or something, there was like supposedly 10 billion years of this stuff getting made without any observer anywhere.
Exactly.
Into being without an observer, waves are turning into particles without any observer.
Right. Exactly. Which isn't possible according to physics, by the way. So
yeah, that's what they say.
So they're really stuck. They're stuck with their own observations. Their own observations are contradictory.
We're not talking about human observers. We're just talking about, a machine that can. Okay.
Right. A machine, which definitionally is built by a human, because there are no machines without human. They really can't get out of the trap. They just try, and then they say, no, right? And again, it's one more piece of data, and we'll have the whole thing. And it's like, you can have an infinite pieces of data. You're not going to get out of this trap.
Well, I'm not sure if we got to this part in the video or not, but I'm just going to read here what John said next.
Yeah, sure.
Says, so God is by definition what escapes our categorizing. And John says, because God is the grounding of the intelligibility that makes the categorical scheme possible.
Right.
Now, define for me, you've told me before that John has a specific meaning when he says intelligibility. So what does he mean when he says that? God is the grounding of the intelligibility that makes the categorical scheme possible.
So when John's talking about intelligibility, he's talking about things that make sense effectively, right? And so this is one of the places I think he's hiding what we call the poetic, or the idea that there's a connection that is beyond logic and reason and rationality, we'll say. And so how things make sense and how you fit into the world is intelligibility, or how you might fit into the world, to be fair, right? So ways you could fit into the world, all of that falls into intelligibility. So once you see, we'll invoke Peugeot because they did. Once you see a pattern, you know how to interact with that pattern. I would call that all poetic ways of understanding or knowing the world, right? But that's where they put intelligibility. They put it in that idea that, oh, there's a set of affordances on one side, and I have a set of affordances available to me, and therefore there's intelligibility, right?
Okay, but when he says it makes the categorical scheme possible, what does that even mean?
This is the trick that they always play, right? To get around the science facts don't tell you what to do, right? So they always say, oh, no, there's this thing called intelligibility, or maybe they use other terms, doesn't really matter, right? They use some magical word. Literally, they're using a magical word, right? And they're saying, well, this is why you put A and B together and not A and C. And it's like, what? No, it's not correct. The reason why we do it is because there's some force that has predetermined these things go together. There's no way around that. They keep saying there is, but there isn't a way around that. But they keep invoking things like intelligibility.
I guess I'm asking you to break it down a little finer for someone like me who doesn't understand all these things that they're talking about. So the categorical scheme.
Yeah.
Now, what I understand that to mean from listening to Jordan talk is that we have to have categories. Otherwise, there's too much stuff.
Right. That's John's combinatorial explosion.
So we have to have categories.
Right.
And the postmodernists say that there's an infinite number of categories, so you can't make a choice.
Right.
And Jordan says, no, there is an infinite number of categories, but there's only a finite and actually a fairly small number of categories that are actually practically useful for you in your trajectory forward. And if you put your eye on the highest goal, then those things will come into your salience field. You'll be able to choose things that are in those categories, and you'll be able to move forward. That's Jordan's categorical scheme. But what does what does John mean when he says that makes the categorical scheme possible?
Right. Well, I mean, that's his magical word, intelligibility. That's his magical appeal. He just says, oh, intelligibility makes a categorical scheme work. It's like, what?
It makes it work.
Yes.
To me, that's different than makes it possible.
Well, possible and work are actually the same thing if you think about it, right? Like
this is why it's so interesting to talk to you. You turn my brain inside out.
Thanks. I think I hope in a good way, right? Because if it doesn't work, it's not possible. Like, and we act this way all the time. We go, well, I can't do that. That's impossible for me. It might be possible in the real world, but it's not possible for me. We talk about things this way all the time, right? And so we confuse possibility and what works. And because I think they're linked, I think they're related, right? Because for something to be possible outside what I'm capable of, you need what? An objective observer. Well, maybe, but so then we say something like, well, God makes it possible. That's true. God makes all things possible. Yes, because he's the objective observer that tells you the intelligibility of the universe. Sure. But you're not getting around God that way. Now you've got to bring him back in. Like, you're never getting around this problem.
What do you do with that knowledge, Mark?
With what knowledge?
What you just said. That God makes all things possible. He tells you
Well,
the intelligibility of the universe. What does that personally mean to you?
well, to me, it's just
very intellectually, but I mean, does it have a personal meaning to you?
well, it's a good, fair question. I'm trying to think of how to describe it, right? So, I mean, it means a lot of things. So the first thing it means is that if you take science seriously and you get to the end of it, which I don't think is all that difficult, by the way, like, I think most people can actually do this, then you run into this problem pretty quickly. And it's pretty obvious what the problem is. And there's only one way out. Sorry. And I keep trying to, no, there's really only one way. You can take any path you want. Go ahead, take them all. I'll wait here. I've taken most of them. I know where they end. They end at, this doesn't work. You've got to postulate something outside the system. And this is Gödel's incompleteness theorem states this too. Like, math doesn't work to map the world, right? You can either have this problem, the completeness problem, or you can have the consistency problem. Like, it's up to you.
But you keep coming back to what you know. You can know that with your head. You can know that
Right.
that's the truth. You can come to the end of yourself. You can come to the end of science, and you can come to the end of yourself on every path that you take, and you can know that there has to be something outside the system, and you still don't know the something.
Right.
You just know that. It's still a proposition.
Right. You have to interact with the potential of the fact that the world cannot be got at through the scientific tools. They're insufficient to understand the miracle that happens around us every day. And the miracle, you could do miracle or miracles. It depends. Do you want to categorize it out, or do you just want to say it's all a miracle? Like how we're here, how we still breathe, how all these things happen, how any of this technology works at all. Like, it's all a miracle.
How does it change your life personally to know this, to have this knowledge?
Well, it keeps you, me in particular, out of nihilism, right? Because I was homeless and nihilistic, and there was no reason. There is no reason to live. That's not, you don't, if you're going to reason your way to life, you're going to suicide yourself. You're going to end up there. It may take a while because we don't, we try to survive. Like, we have a built-in survival instinct that tries to prevent us from doing this fairly effectively. But if you take it seriously, you'll end up nihilistic. And people do it all the time. And, unfortunately, we have suicides are way up, right? Because, man, if I'm stuck at home all day on the computer playing video games, what's my reason? Yeah, you don't have one, right? And so it's important to ground yourself in potential, because you don't know what's possible. You've no idea what's possible. No idea. And even with all the things I've been through, with losing everything I own twice, getting it stolen from me by my culture, basically, effectively. I'm still hopeful that something's going to, go in the right direction, we'll say, in a different direction, and that's going to open up more potential possibility to me somehow, that's going to afford me a better relationship in the world. And I'm.
So, I mean, there are a lot of people. I mean, forgive me if you feel like I'm prying too much, but
no, that's fine.
There are a lot of people who are who inhabit the new age space, where they would call that potential the universe, and they would say, the universe this and the universe that, and they have all this hope in the potential, and the Tony Robbins talk, and there's a lot of talk out there. There's many different paths that you can take to get that, but none of them actually approach the ineffable.
Right.
So do you differentiate in your life between just the universe talk or the goddess grace or whatever, and actually the one who is the ineffable transcendent?
Yeah, I think you have to. So the reason why I'm not in my office today is because one of my uncles passed away very suddenly, and so I had to drive up to New England. So I'm at my friend's house, and one of the things that occurred to me as I was talking to my aunt yesterday, I went to church with her. I normally don't go to church, and she's Catholic. Beautiful church in Concord, New Hampshire, by the way, absolutely gorgeous. Like, wow, they just redid the place, stained glass. It's very beautiful, modern, but old looking building. And and they're talking about, I think it's the Assumption of Mary or something this week. And I'm like, I don't know what any of this stuff means. So, but it's very striking. And it occurred to me, I told her this at lunch afterwards. I said, so my Uncle Ad, her husband, was was a staunch defender of pretty much everybody and hopefulness in general. And he was very patient. And I pointed out, well, my father and I aren't talking because he's not able to engender the good in the world. He's only able to engender the evil. And my Uncle Ed was the only one who was telling him, like, no, he's defending him at every turn. And I'm like, well, you can defend him all you want, but like, I'm out. Like, I'm not talking to him anymore because he keeps doing this. And I can't, I don't want that in my life. Like, that's all. I just don't want that in my life. If you guys can deal with him, that's fine. But I don't have any reason to deal with him. All he's going to do is lie to me again and again and again and again. This is what he does. And he can't help it because he's trapped in a decision that he made. And that's fine. Like, people are allowed to be trapped in the decisions they make. But here's this guy, and my father was not very nice to Ed at all. Never. And they got into big political discussions because they're on the opposite side of the aisle, if there is such a thing. Although apparently my father now owns a gun. What? So yeah. It's just funny how these sides don't work, right? If a bunch of liberals are buying guns, what side are they on now? I don't get it. But anyway, very staunch opposition, and I had still defended him. And I'm like, look, I mean, I can't fault the guy for being hopeful, but I'm not going to engage. Like, if something changes, it'll change. I'll see it. But otherwise, I have no need to engage with people who are going to repeatedly lie to me and promise me things and, say obnoxious, really horrible things, not intentionally, like he's not being malicious, but he says really horrible things like all the time to me. And I'm just like, did you just say that in front of me? Do you understand who you're talking to? And he, but Ed was always a defender. And basically he's lost his last defender because everybody else is fed up to hear with his garbage. So, it is what it is. But like, what explains that? He wasn't even nice to him. I think at a certain point after I yelled at him a few years ago and said, no, this is your sister's choice. You don't get to have an opinion on it. If she wants to marry, and he was the nicest guy. Heck, I have two really nice uncles. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how they're so nice, but they're really nice.
Well, it sounds like he was a dispenser of grace, right?
He was. Yeah. Exactly. Well, where does it come from, Karen? It doesn't come from the universe. Hello? Where is it being dispensed from? Right. And so you see this, you see these people like this, even Tony Robbins, who sure maybe uses more propositional language than you'd like. Where does that come from? He's got a spark in him. I can't describe that. It's the universal spark of the star Sirius in the fourth house of the Sagittarius. I don't know. What are the New Age people thought about? Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. What makes more sense to me is that there's a divine aspect, the ineffable, that manifests itself in not a material way at all, an ethereal way through people that we have access to, because you see people become this. They don't start out that way. Well, obviously, we all started as babies. Babies are all the same. They're all little robots.
That's the great thing that John does when he talks about agape, when he talks about how babies are loved into.
Yes.
There's a danger in what he says. I mean, there's a beautiful thing. It sounds beautiful that babies are loved into personhood.
Yes.
That's very dangerous because of our culture making these bioethical decisions now about what is personhood and when does a person become a person. And there are a lot of ethicists who believe that until someone is a person, you can just snuff them out. And so some of them say a person isn't a person until they're 2 years old. And so you can snuff babies out if they're inconvenient. And
right.
So there's a danger in that, but there's also a beauty in this idea that a mother, through the agape love that she shows, even though it's not reciprocated, right, continues to pour that love in. And that was one of the beautiful things for me of being a mom this time around, because the first time I was mom with my older daughter, I wasn't a believer. And and I was very young. I was 21, and what is it? 21 years old? You're just a vapor. You're just a cipher, basically. And I didn't think about anything. I didn't know anything. I took care of my daughter. I took good care of her, but I never thought about anything. But this time around, I was a Christian, and this little one is growing, and strange things would come into my mind, like when I'd be changing a diaper, especially a bad one, I'd be like, oh, this is what my sin looks like to God. And he's so gracious to clean up my sin and to love me anyway, and I have this opportunity to clean up her poop and still love her just for who she is without her doing anything for me. And
Right. Well, the agape should begin before that, right? With the act that creates the unique DNA, which I think scientifically, it's the unique DNA that creates life, guys. I hate to break it to you. That's scientifically true when life begins, by the way. Yeah. And the Hitlerian, purification of the, oh, well, these are bad batch here. We'll have to get rid of them. That doesn't cut it for me because it's very unscientific.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the really, someone asked in the comments from our last episode about what it was that you were talking about, the intimacy crisis, because your whole theory about this being an intimacy crisis instead of a meaning crisis, I think is like spot on, because it's not just, all of the things that have gone on in the last century, including birth control, abortion, all of those things, just steal the guts out of what it means to love, to see the personhood in that life that takes place at conception when the DNA puts together and
well, I love a lump of cells. Like, what the hell, right? When you scientifically and literally analyze things, why waste your time on that? And because it's, John makes this argument, right?
If you can get these embryos and you can look at them and, well, this one's a girl, this one's a boy, and they're frozen, and so I can pick whichever one I want. Oh, I'll pick the girl and just will throw the boy away, or this one might likely be obese in later life, and they can tell that from the DNA. Well, I don't want something like that. Well, so when you can pick and choose the perfect child, then when they start growing up and they're not perfect, what are you going to do?
Right.
There's going to be child abuse,
Well, then why would you bother? Like, what's the point? If you've got a little robot that's just going to be the way you want it to be, where's the mystery? Where's the surprise? Where's all this agape coming from? Because John talks about this, like, your quality of life goes down when you become a parent, not up. Mm-hmm. So if you're narcissistic, you don't want to have kids. Fair enough. Scientifically, that's true.
The best reason to have kids is to learn out how selfish you are so that you can work on it.
There you go. Right. But again, if the agape begins before that with an act of love that results in something to love that grows from the love, well, that's great. But where's all this love coming from again, Karen? I don't know. Is it just popping out of the universe? Is the universe stuffed with love and we're just a conduit to the love within the universe? No, that's crazy. Yeah, I don't buy the new agey people. I studied all that stuff. It's crazy.
You did it again. You got me laughing.
Oh, good. Bring a little joy into the world. Where did that come from? That joy. Yeah, it just keeps going.
Well, I think we blew through an hour and 10 minutes here on the first 4 minutes of the video.
Well, the rest is actually, I don't think is that hard. I mean, because
it's not hard, but we're about to get into icons and idols, which is very.
Oh yeah, you want to spend a lot of time on that.
Well, I do. I think that's very interesting. Now, if you're not interested in spending times on icons and idols, I can have that conversation with Michael.
No, I'd love to do it with you. I mean, you should have it with both of us probably, because we're going to have totally different. I have a very shallow understanding, and we're always working on this particular problem. So yeah, I'd love to do another session about that if you'd like.
Oh, you do another session. Well, I was thinking maybe we could do some of it here, because then we get up to about 2:10. And
well, do you think we can finish? If we can finish your curiosity off about it, we can do it now. Sure.
Okay. Well, let's.
Either way, I don't know what your time constraints are, so I'm trying to be mindful.
Yeah, I'm good for another 15 or 20 minutes. And I don't think we start straining people until we get past an hour and a half.
Okay, fair enough. Let's
What do
do
I
it.
know? And this would be a good time to tell people, if you like this content, you should like it, because that does get it out there to more people.
Right.
And I have noticed that, we get all these data points from YouTube, and they tell me that some of my videos get an average view of about 7 or 8 minutes, and some of my views get an average view of about 15 to 20 minutes. And the ones you and I have been doing have been getting an average of 15 to 20 minutes, which is good. But
Oh, that's
I'd
very
love
good.
to see the average be that they'd watch the whole video, because there's all these hidden gems in there, right?
Hopefully.
Yeah. So, okay, let's watch I guess we did watch the part about the icon and idol, didn't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
We watched that whole thing. Yeah. So if you want to launch into it, we can do that.
Yes. Okay. So, John says you make icons, not idols. And that summons Jonathan back into the conversation. And Jordan says, what's the distinction? Jordan comes up with this mapping that art is the icon and propaganda is the idol, which,
Yes.
I think that's an interesting distinction, but I think it's just very, in some ways, a very shallow distinction, because art can also be an idol.
Or it can become an idol. But I think the idol is the relationship that you have with the thing. So it's incomplete and misframed to some extent. So I agree with you there.
Okay, so why don't you tell me first where you think the misframing is?
So Paul Vanderklay talks about this a lot, right? He says there's a difference between what does he use? Does he use idol, or does he use, I think he uses dogma. He says there's a difference between dogma and dogmatic, right? And so the dogmatism is not in the dogma, it's in how you're approaching the dogma. So if the dogma is the proposition, and I think that's true, dogma is propositional, that's correct, but your relationship with it is that is complete, that's everything you need to know, then it's dogmatism.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the same relationship right there. So we're saying an icon, if you say reject the icon, right? We'll use Paul's terms again. If you reject the icon, then it becomes an idol. Whereas if you accept it, you move through it and into it and see it, the greater thing behind the icon.
Okay. Yeah.
It's all about the relationship to the thing, not the thing. And if the relationship is relationship can be idolatrous, in other words, it contains the whole, or it can be iconic, in other words, it doesn't contain the whole. The whole is bigger than the thing you're interacting with.
Yeah. So I was thinking about certain things like, let's say, sports figures. It's possible to make idols out of your sports figures, right? Because the relationship you have with them is that becomes the center of your universe. That's all you can think about. You wear their shirts, you wear their shirts, all this kind. But it is also possible, I think theoretically possible, that you could look through the sports figure to what it is that made them great.
Yes.
Recognize the work that they've done. Use that as kind of an iconic image for you to succeed, right? For you to push yourself. Exactly.
And also, it occurs to me now that we're talking about this, also, maybe with an idol, you can only have one, but maybe with an icon, you can have lots, because you realize it's not the end, it's not complete, it's not the thing.
Oh no, you can have lots of idols, because you can be driven by money, and you can be driven by food, and you can be driven by sex, and you can be driven by all of those things. And you
can idolize anything, right? Because it's in the relationship. But if you were idolizing a sports figure, maybe you would be like the best of all the sports. Whereas if you're iconizing the sports figure, you'd be like, oh, well, this is the best at basketball, but he's not the best at baseball, right? Because people do that a lot. They go, well, the best athlete of all time is, and they pick one athlete. It's like, I think athletics is too big to have one guy be the best at everything, I think so. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but it just seems weird. And there are a couple of guys have done basketball and baseball and, hockey or something. But no one's, superb at all of them, right? They might be superb at one or two of them, but they're not going to hit all four big sports, we'll say, or much less all of athletics. Even, there's some Olympians that compete in multiple related and unrelated sports, but like they're still not gold medalists in everything. They may be gold medalists in all running, because running's a little bit easier, we'll say, to some extent. But, they're not going to hit all the sports. So they're not the greatest athlete. Like, how do you measure that? But some people cast it that way, and I think they're idolizing instead of making an icon out of them.
Hmm.
Not exclusive. I'm just saying it's more likely. If you're idolizing, you're totalizing.
Well, there were a couple things about idols that I wanted to point out from the text. Not that everything is in the text, but I want to point this out from the text. So I'm going to show a couple of I don't know which one of these screens is the right screen now. It's kind of killing me.
You have too many screens.
I have too many screens up. You can see this now, right?
Yes.
This is from Isaiah chapter 44. This is talking about how an idol comes to be. Okay. The craftsman of iron shapes a cutting tool and does his work over the coals, fashioning it with hammers and working it with his strong arm. He also gets hungry and his strength fails. He drinks no water and becomes weary. The craftsman of wood extends a measuring line. He outlines it with a marker. He works it with carving knives and outlines it with a compass and makes it like the form of a man, like the beauty of mankind, so that it may sit in a house. He will cut cedars for himself, and he takes a holm oak or another oak and lets it grow strong for himself among the trees of the forest. He plants a laurel tree and the rain makes it grow. All these resources come from somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Then it becomes something for a person to burn. So he takes one of them and gets warm. He also makes a fire and bakes bread. And he also makes a god and worships it. Out of this self-same hunk of wood, right? You can either burn it and cook your food, or you can carve it into an idol and make something. So half of it he burns in the fire. He warms himself and says, aha, I am warm, I have seen the fire. Yet the rest of it he makes into a god, his carved image. He bows down before it and worships. He also prays to it and says, save me, for you are my God. And to me, that's the key right there. Save me, for you are my God. That's what you say to an idol.
Yeah, it's totalizing. And,
right?
and it's expecting a result.
For me, for example, one of the things I struggle with is letting food become an idol. Because if I'm upset about something, I look to food to save me. Food's going to make me feel better, right? If I'm sad about something, food is going to make me happy. These are all lies that idols tell. Idols tell you lies. That's the point of an idol.
Okay,
right?
maybe.
And another thing I think that's in this passage about an idol is that it can have two parts. Half of the wood is useful. It's very necessary for life. You can use it for cooking. You can use it for warming. But the other half you take and you bow down to it and you say, this is what's going to save me. So eating is a perfectly normal part of life. It's very good. It's a valuable thing. It's a gift. It can be, wonderful and tasty and lovely, and it nourishes and makes you healthy and all of that. But
right.
Also be the side of it that becomes this lie that governs your life, right? And that's why I say Jordan is leaving out that part of it when he says that art is the icon, because art can be looked at in any of these ways. Art can,
right.
And an icon, if the icon becomes something that you look to save you, that can also be an idol.
Right.
So it's all, like you said, it's all in the relationship that you have. Now, here's another one. I like this one because this is Habakkuk 2:18. What benefit is a carved image when its maker has carved it, or a cast metal image, a teacher of falsehood? here, another version says a teacher of lies.
Oh,
And this cast metal image in one version, I can't remember which version it is. It almost sounds like it's talking about a television.
oh, really? Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. And of
Yeah.
course, it's not talking about a television, but that's also the way TV can function in our lives, because we're
Right.
watching it all the time and we're letting it colonize us, right? And so it's teaching us falsehoods. The maker trusts in his own handiwork when he fashions speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise. That is your teacher? You know? Anyway, I just think these are kind of amazing. And this one I think is very instructive. This is Psalm 115. Where then is their God? Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths, but they cannot speak. They have eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but they cannot hear. They have noses, but they cannot smell. They have hands, but they cannot feel. They have all the sensory apparatus, but they are not embodied, right? So they can't get at this. They cannot make a sound with their throat. And then this verse 8 right here, those who make them will become like them. Everyone who trusts in them will become like them. That is the real danger with idols, is that you become like what you look at, where you put your attention.
Attention, yes.
Right? So it's
right.
I forget what the word was, your attentional resource. Your values are where you put your attentional resource. So if you're putting your
salient landscape
resource in dead idols, then you're going to become like your dead idol. So in that, when he says propaganda is an idol, I think that's absolutely correct, because these totalizing systems, your whole focus is inside there. You're trapped in there. You can't see anything else. We have friends that. This is going to be really controversial if I say this, but we have friends who absolutely will not even consider being vaccinated because of what they've heard inside their bubble. We all have a bubble, right?
Right.
But they have not looked outside their bubble at anything, and they're inside. And these are not people who have any reason, any health reasons that a vaccine would be maybe dangerous for them, but they absolutely will not consider it. And they're really, really good friends. And so then we have to start thinking, well, then what do we do in the future when things open up about having social events and all that? So we were thinking about that. We were thinking, and then all of a sudden we find out this friend has COVID now, and he's my age. It's not good to get COVID when you're my age.
Yeah.
And he refused the vaccine because, and his wasn't for medical reasons. It was because strictly a political issue. For him, it was a political issue because of the box that he lives in. And, and I think that's where the danger comes with propaganda, is it narrows your vision to this extreme that you can't see anything outside.
Well, it also forced the problem with propaganda is it kills you both ways, because if you have a set of propaganda about something, then you're forced to take the opposite. Some people are going to be forced to take the opposite side of it because they're going to see it for what it is. And it's like, oh, right. And this is, so what happened, in Nazi Germany was you were either in the propaganda or you were outside the propaganda and probably soon to be dead. Right. And so the propaganda, cuts things in half. I mean, it deliberately separates and makes a binary where there isn't one, right? It separates people. And so especially when you're talking about, I have a video on this, right? This is why you don't use the political frame for anything ever, because it's always wrong. It can't be right. You can put anything in a political frame. You can. It's not hard. It's just wrong.
That's all we do nowadays. Everything is in a political frame nowadays.
Right, because we're shrinking things down into single identities to try and fit ethics in or something, right? But it's wrong because it has to divide, and it has to divide arbitrarily, right? And then it's either you jump into the propaganda or you jump out of it. But people who see the propaganda, who are like, oh, these guys, these guys are just anti-Jewish. That's all they are. They're they can seem insane, right? Because, well, everyone's doing it. I mean, even in New York City, they couldn't hire Jews, even though we far away from Germany as you can get, right? So everyone kind of either jumped on board or jumped off board, but it creates this dichotomy that doesn't have to be there. It creates this schism that doesn't have to exist. And it only takes one side to buy into propaganda. And then the propaganda is active and becomes a force in the world at that point, because you're either for it or against it, right? It becomes something because if it's wrong, and, let's say vaccines turn out to be an evil plot to sterilize everybody or something, right? The people who see it as an icon for sterilization are engaging with it correctly, and the people who see it as an idol are just saying, oh, either you get a vaccine or you're bad. Mm-hmm. The people on the other side have many reasons for not getting vaccines. Some of them may seem reasonable and some may not.
I've had this discussion with my husband many times, because I do think that there are valid reasons for not getting a vaccine. And I know people who have valid reasons, but for someone who has absolutely no valid reason, and the only reason they're doing it is because of a political perspective on some belief that the government is using this to, well, and I suppose if you went far enough off the team, you could believe that. I mean,
exert control, or Jonathan Peugeot talks about it as, well, look, there's a lot of similarities between vaccines and vaccine passports and Mark of the Beast. Yeah, fair enough. And that's where the idolization and the propaganda happens, is that, oh, well, we're just going to categorize everybody who doesn't have a vaccine as having an invalid reason, right? And so the person whether they have a valid reason or not doesn't want to be in that camp. Well, fair enough. Like maybe you shouldn't be in that camp.
But one of the things that happens when this occurs is that you can't have valid conversations about it and tease out where the problems might lie in the lack of lack of communication between people. Because the minute you try to talk about it, well, that doesn't fit my frame, that doesn't fit my box, and so you're bad. And so you can't even get together and say, well, hey, where did we go wrong on this? What are the
once it's idolized, I think that's true. I think that's the danger in idolization. I don't think that's true if it's not idolized. So, and I make this point all over the place every time I can, right? Like, there aren't even 3 political buckets. So I'm like a moderate. I've always been a moderate, always be a moderate, always have been a moderate. Like, I've never been, supporter of Republicans or supporter of Democrats. And, you can make an argument that I hate one way more than the other. And I have my reasons. And if you want to argue the reasons, that's fine, because I'll watch you lose that argument all day long. Because it boils down to values. And most people don't know what their values are. They're effectively unethical because they can't have a sense of ethics, because they don't know what their values are. And so when you get into that game, because all I care about is what your values are. I don't care how you use them. In some sense, like, I can be friends with a serial killer because I can understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, even if I disagree. Because, and that's not to say I'd let one live if I had the opportunity to kill one, but again, that's me. Like, I've got my lines, and if you cross my lines, I'm willing to, probably precludes me from being a Christian, for example. And I'm fine with that because I have my reasons and I stick by them because I have my own sense of ethics is very clear. I mean, it kept me alive. So that's kind of important, at least to me. So once you idolize things, you end up in this dichotomy. But if you don't idolize things and you don't judge people on the basis of their value structure, then it's reasonable. Because if your value is, I ain't never going to do nothing the government tells me to do, that's a value. I'm okay with that. Like, I'd be fine in Appalachia because that's their attitude about everything. If the government says it, it must be bad. Yeah, fair enough. There's a good rule of thumb. You're going to be right more than you're wrong with that rule. Is it valid in all cases? No, but if you need a simple rule, it's a good one. It's not a bad one. Like, I'm never going to believe anything written in the New York Times. Best rule ever, by the way. You'll be right more often than you're wrong. And if you're betting, and the world is a gamble because there's randomness, if you're betting, you only need to be right more often than you're wrong. And so for things where you're outsourcing to these simple ways of understanding the world because you're not smart enough to understand something deeply, fair enough. Like, I've got no complaint with you there. And maybe I see the train that's coming for you to hit you, but maybe it misses you, because that's part of the miracle too. Sometimes people have no valid reason for not getting hit by what we would call reality or the fact of the matter or whatever it is. Like, some people are going to get COVID and not having gotten vaccinated and be totally fine. And then, some people, like I found out today, my buddy is in very big danger, right? Very big danger. He's getting up in age and he's got diabetes and heart condition and, the whole thing, right? But it turns out he's taking this cholesterol drug that they just found out just happens to make you, less likely to get COVID. And if you do get it, it's less severe. And it's just a cholesterol drug. That's all it is. Right. And so, in its early days, maybe they'll reverse their decision on that, but it certainly seems like the FDA is taking it seriously right at the moment. So it's kind of like, well, what do we really know about the world? Maybe the don't need a vaccine thing is true. Like, and we're not going to know for 5 or 10 years. Right. Which I know a lot of people took the vaccine and got sick, and they never took the second dose because they couldn't, because they got sick on the first dose, and they got so sick that it was, that some people are sick for months.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it would be really good if we lived in a world where we could get legitimate data on those things to know what the percentage is, because.
Well, and that's the certainty problem. That's where idolization versus iconization comes in. Like, an idol is a certain thing, literally a certain thing, and a thing of certainty. It's like, well, and that's where the problems come in, because that creates the binary, that creates the dichotomy. That's where you get into trouble. Whereas art is not a certain thing. Your paintings mean one thing to you, and they mean something different to everybody else who views them, because you made them. You have that participatory knowledge of what it takes to make that painting. And all I have is some view through your eyes after all of that hard work was done. And so it's like, oh, well, that's an icon.
And part of the things that an artist strives for is to leave openings.
Mm-hmm. Right.
To leave places that are not defined, so that there is a place for the viewer to interact with the work.
Right. And that's where the negative space concept came in. And that's part of that, that movement, right? That whole concept around this opening up, which is very much the difference between an idol and an icon. The idol is closed. It's a set, discrete, linear, closed world. The icon, you accept it. You have to accept it. Otherwise, it can become an idol. But if you accept it, it can open up to you. And if you can open up with it, that you can absorb the potential within the art.
Mm-hmm. I want to just check my notes here, see if I left out anything else. An icon draws you up to be taken up into the transcendent.
Yeah.
Okay. And in my mind, drawn up into Christ. That's what the icon does. But an idol comes at you from below. An idol comes at you through the flesh, the world, and the devil. Proposition. Whatever that might be. Yeah. And it seeks to colonize you. And so it comes up into you, takes you over, empties you out, hollows you out. But an icon draws you up into the transcendent. And
then you try to fit yourself into the idol, whereas the icon, you try to fit within it.
Well, to go, like you said, it's more like a portal into the ineffable, the transcendent.
Right, a portal. That's a good way to put it.
When the feminine is intended to be an icon, becomes an idol, right? That's a possibility. Idols make use of the human need for icons, because an icon is a way shower. The icon shows the way. But when we get lost in the darkness, we're looking around for a way shower. And this idol comes up and that's going to show me the way. And so then we get stuck on that thing, whatever that thing is, because we're looking for something to show us the way.
Right. But any piece of art can turn into an idol. Right?
Yes.
And maybe not any idol can be an icon. I don't know. That'd be an interesting
Well,
thing.
that's one of the things, but I was wondering, can even an idol become an icon? I wonder if that happens sometimes when people go through cognitive dissonance, when they've gotten so far down a track, like some of these people are getting red pilled just by, they got so much into their propaganda world, into their political frame, and then something happens and they're like, wait a minute, this isn't what I thought it was. And they start waking up, then does that also become an icon and a way through for them to see the cognitive dissonance actually opens this way up and to get out, right?
Sure. Well, to some extent, I mean, it certainly cracks open the idol, right? Because like I said, I now know somebody who's staunch on the left who has a gun. So you're a gun owner in Massachusetts. You're a gun owner in Massachusetts. First of all, congratulations. That's hard to do. Second of all, what the hell? Like, what is that? You're on the wrong side politically now. How did this? Obviously, the idol broke open. And
so there's some fear. Is there something going on in Massachusetts that's causing that level of fear?
There's so many things going on in Massachusetts. I talked to Chris Petkow on his YouTube channel. We had a great 2-hour plus conversation. There's a 56-minute version just for Christians and the church and the gaslighting, but which is great. I actually watched it again. Like, oh, what's wrong with you, Mark? You narcissist. But I thought Chris was brilliant too. But one of the things I was sort of pointing out was like when you look around. I mean, I moved out of Massachusetts like 5 or 6 years ago. I forget. But I knew all this was going to happen. Not all this. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew it was getting bad. And one of the interesting things that happened is not only did the traffic patterns all change, like overnight, within a month, all the traffic patterns that had been in there for decades just vanished. Like you couldn't make sense. The intelligibility of the traffic went away, literally. And I was like, well, that's weird. Well, why? The city can't take it, in essence, right? I was like, oh, it changed this fast. You can't be absorbed in a city this size. It's not possible. So the number of car accidents doubled pretty much overnight. I had already left. I was like, I'm out of here. Bye, guys. Have fun crumbling. And then the number of car deaths went way up. And then when COVID hit, the number of cars on the road, they estimated at half what it was. And the number of accidents and road deaths stayed the same. So there's some invariance in that pattern, right? There's some fractal nature to what change happened, such that it was no longer tied to the number of cars on the road anymore. And so what else happened? Well, now there's shootings, right? So the murder rate's way up.
What was the trigger for all this?
Now we're in speculation land. A lot of things changed in Boston.
You saw something happen 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And then after that thing happened, then all the changes took place. You don't have to say. I mean, I don't want to.
Yeah, no. I don't know. A bunch of weird things happened. Like one thing that happened, and one thing that I've been told since that's even worse now, that I just found out yesterday, actually. So what happened was a lot of foreign investment came into the city, and they also started to build. And so they had started this building campaign, all this foreign investment, as in not from this country investment, buying in Boston. And one of the effects of that might be that people were leaving the city on a Friday. So Friday morning commutes were great. Friday evening commutes were the same as Saturday. There was no rush hour traffic at all on Friday evening. Didn't exist. Literally didn't exist in most of the roads in Boston. People just, in the summer, people took Friday off. Nobody was driving on the roads. And that went from that situation to a 2-hour commute to go 12 miles in a month. That happened in a month. And I went, whoa, what? But the other factor could be that there were all these cars on the Mass Pike in particular, because I was in Marlborough. So Boston's 25 miles away. I would just go Mass Pike straight in. All these cars on the Mass Pike, what was my last count? About 32.3% of them were New Jersey and New York and Connecticut plates. And I said, why are all these people from New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut coming into Boston? What are they doing? That's crazy. And some of it was the employment, but a lot of it might have been the construction. So I don't know if it was the construction per se, or if it was something around that. But that certainly happened. And the other thing that happened at the same time was they couldn't fix roads anymore, not within a reasonable time frame. And I was like, well, this is like driving through New York or New Jersey or Connecticut, all of which are places where they're famous for taking years to do what is ostensibly less than a month's worth of work on the road. And so that was never the pattern in Boston. And then, not that they didn't have their share of long things, but most of the things got done quickly in Massachusetts,
Well,
construction wise.
was there a big change in the political leadership before all this started happening?
Well, yeah, there was that too.
Okay.
There might have been a switch in party on the governorship, which never happened before because it was always democratically run with a Republican governor, and then one time it wasn't. And then that might have spelled disaster for every social program and absolutely everything that happened in Massachusetts. Yeah, that certainly happened too. And I don't know what the relationship is. Like, I'm not saying the foreign money didn't come first and by the Democratic governor, because that could have happened too. We may have seen that happen before. Like JFK definitely got the presidency by buying it. JFK was not the most popular. And yeah, I'm a big JFK fan, but like, he bought the presidency. Come on, guys. Like this, even I who love almost everything about him. No, he definitely, nice moderate Democrat, probably the last moderate Democrat we had in the country, by the way, but that's just my opinion. So a bunch of things happened, and I don't know if the demographics changes the politics or the politics changes demographics, or like, I don't know what that interaction is, but these patterns break down, and then you can see it, and then you get out, and then next thing you know, there's Newbury Street, which is one of the most expensive shopping areas in the world. There's shooting over the weekend, I think, or recently within the past week, and that's what's going on. And the shooting, the guy was killed the other day. It's the news up here is nuts. I'm glad I don't watch it. I'm like, this is horrifying. I'm glad I don't live here. It's terrible. So what caused the changes? I don't know, but I saw them. They happened well before COVID, and I saw them, and I said, I got to get out of here now. I got one last shot, and I took my shot and went to South Carolina. So thank goodness, right on time.
Well, so I have a couple more things here, and I'll just say these and we'll round this out. And then I think we're going to have to finish the rest of this another time because we only got up to 2:07 or something. So here's the last thing I have here. The idol calls out and says, if you only have me, you will be fulfilled and happy and satisfied. The icon calls out and says, if you only have God, the transcendent 3-in-1 to whom I am pointing you, you will be fulfilled, happy, and satisfied. Propaganda says, join our group, our party, our revolution, and you will get everything you ever wanted.
Right.
And art says, look into me, look beyond me, keep looking upward where beauty and meaning are to be found.
Yeah. And again, it gets back to this binary nature. Once you idolize something, you create the binary. It doesn't require the other participants who aren't buying into the idol, because you're now viewing the world as either you're in the idol with us or you're not. And so you're the one that creates a dichotomy. Dichotomy doesn't exist on the other side at all. But I think there's a danger in assuming that art always draws us up and out.
Yeah.
I think art can draw us down and in too.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, we've certainly seen that in the last century. I mean, I think of like Damien Hirst. He's the guy who takes a cow and slices it right down the middle and puts half of it in a tank of formaldehyde inside a glass case and gets
that's horrific.
Museums. Yes, that's in museums because
no, that's
different because it's weird.
That's not museums I would ever go to, but yeah, okay.
Well, I mean, that's the kind of thing that's in museums now, or
So there's a bias implied there that the idol is almost universally bad because it creates this false dichotomy, this false us and them thing that doesn't exist without the idol. But the icon can also be bad, and so 2/3 of the outcome of icons and idols are bad, and only 1/3 is good, which is why we have to keep pointing at it. We have to keep pointing at this thing above us, outside of us, that transcends us, because otherwise we have nothing to aspire to. We have no aspiration, and therefore we can have no inspiration. We can't have intention to be better if there isn't a better.
Now, I forget, did you, on our first episode, you gave me some links. Was the link in there to your discussion of your 4 ways of knowing, the way you guys have laid it out with the perspectival?
Oh,
that space?
I don't know, because there's one on your channel, there's one on Paul's channel. We talk about it twice with Mary Cohen.
I mean, do you have
yes.
one where
So
you
this,
just laid it out without somebody else talking to you, or is it mainly these ones that you've had conversations with us and with Paul and with Mary?
I don't have one. No, and I think the best one is our hour and 34 minutes or something that we did. Because the one with Paul is only an hour. And also I laid it out differently because I talked to you second. And so in some sense, you got the best bite of the apple there.
Okay.
But maybe I'll do one on my channel at some point, or I'll do one with Manuel, even better.
Okay, I'll relink to that one so that everybody can look at it if they want. And in the meanwhile, I hope you have a great week. This has been very intellectually stimulating, as usual.
Well, thank you. I agree. You're really helping me to help coalesce some of my ideas. And it's good because I'm talking to you. I'm talking to Chris Petkow on his YouTube channel. I've got my YouTube channel, right? And I'm trying to put up more content there as well to kind of, all this stuff helps me to solidify my thoughts and communicate, because I think it's important that we know what the heck's going on in the world, right? And we got to make sense of something. And John talks about intelligibility. Well, that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to avoid idols and go towards icons, and icons that give us that higher view. So yeah, it's been excellent.
Okay, signing off.
See you.
We'll see you next week, maybe.
Hopefully, yes.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.